Did my father-in-law really try to drug me at a family party? I'm Emma Carter, a 30-years-old freelance graphic designer from Portland, Oregon. I've clawed my way up from late-night pixel tweaks to landing major tech contracts, but to my in-laws. Richard and Susan, I'm just a doodler unworthy of their son, Liam. Every family gathering was a battlefield, Richard's snide remarks about my income. Susan's icy glares when I shared my latest project. I swallowed it all for Liam, who'd squeeze my hand in silent apology. But at their 35th anniversary party, everything shattered. I caught Richard slipping a pill into my wine glass when he thought I wasn't looking. His smile as he handed it to me, "Special for you, Emma," sent chills down my spine. Heart-pounding, I swapped my glass with Mark's, my brother-in-law who'd just mocked me for not affording a house. 30 minutes later, Mark was pale, staggering to the bathroom, retching loudly. Richard's eyes locked onto mine, dark with realization. In that moment, I knew he'd meant that drug for me, and he knew I'd outsmarted him. What would you do if your in-laws crossed that line? Stick around, because this story only gets wilder. I didn't grow up with much, just a single mom in a small Idaho town, stitching clothes to make ends meet. She taught me that hard work and creativity could carve a path anywhere, even when the world tells you to settle. I fell in love with drawing as a kid, sketching landscapes on the back of old grocery lists. By high school, I discovered graphic design, and at Click, this was how I'd tell stories. Not with words, but with colors, shapes, and pixels. After college, I moved to Portland, hustling as a freelancer. I started with small gigs, logos for local coffee shops, flyers for bands, until I built a portfolio strong enough to land contracts with tech startups. It wasn't easy. There were nights I doubted myself, staring at a blank screen, wondering if I'd ever make it. But every project I nailed pushed me forward, and by 27, I was starting to make a name for myself. That's when I met Liam. It was at a tech conference where I was presenting a user interface I'd designed for a fitness app. Liam, a software engineer, approached me after my talk, asking thoughtful questions about my process. He had this quiet confidence, a warm smile that made my nerves settle. We grabbed coffee, then dinner, and soon we were inseparable. He got my need to create, just like I admired his precision in coding. 2 years later, we got married in a small ceremony by the Columbia River, surrounded by friends and my mom. I thought life couldn't get better. Then I met his parents. Richard and Susan were everything I wasn't. Richard ran a prestigious law firm in downtown Portland, the kind that handled million-dollar cases. He wore tailored suits, drove a Tesla, and measured success by bank accounts and social status. Susan was a picture-perfect housewife, hosting lavish parties to flaunt their wealth. Their colonial-style mansion in the West Hills screamed old money, marble floors, crystal chandeliers, the works. From our first meeting, I felt their disappointment. Graphic design? That's creative, Susan said, her smile tight, like she was swallowing something bitter. Richard was blunter. Liam's got a bright future, he told me once, eyeing me over his scotch. He needs someone who can keep up. The message was clear, I wasn't that someone. Liam's older sister, Claire, and her husband, Mark, weren't much better. Claire, a part-time event planner, seemed nice enough but distant, always deferring to her parents. Mark, a surgeon, was Richard's pride and joy. He'd brag about his 6-figure bonuses while smirking at me, saying things like, "Must be tough scraping by on freelance gigs, huh?" I'd laugh it off, but each jab stung. Liam saw it too. He'd apologize after every family dinner, his hand squeezing mine under the table. "They're just protective," he'd say. "They'll come around." I wanted to believe him. I didn't want him torn between me and his family, so I played nice. I brought fancy wines to their parties, shared my latest designs, even offered to create free graphics for Susan's charity events. Nothing worked. To them, I was a phase Liam would outgrow, not a wife. There were signs I should have taken more seriously. Susan would forget to include me in family photos, claiming it was an oversight. Richard once pulled Liam aside at a barbecue, loud enough for me to hear, suggesting he think long-term about his choice of partner. Mark was the worst. At Claire's birthday last year, he got drunk and cornered me. "You don't fit here, Emma," he slurred. "This family's out of your league." I brushed it off, telling myself it was just booze talking, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. They all wanted me gone. The night of Richard and Susan's 35th anniversary party was supposed to be a celebration. But it felt like walking into a lion's den. Their mansion in Portland's West Hills was decked out, white roses on every table. A string quartet playing softly, and a dining room glowing under a massive chandelier. I'd spent the week finalizing a huge contract with a tech company, designing their app's entire visual identity. The deal was a game changer, enough to put a down payment on a house, and I was buzzing with pride. Liam, my husband, warned me not to expect much from his parents. "They're tough to impress," he said, squeezing my hand as we pulled into their driveway. I nodded, but deep down, I hoped this milestone might finally earn me a shred of respect. I was wrong. The party was in full swing when we arrived. Guests in tailored suits and glittering dresses mingled, sipping champagne. I wore a simple emerald dress, feeling out of place among the wealth on display. Liam looked sharp in a navy blazer, his arm around me as we greeted his parents. Susan gave me a quick nod, her smile reserved for Liam. Richard shook my hand, his grip crushing, and said, "Good to see you, Emma. Still keeping busy with your little designs?" His tone dripped with condescension. Before I could respond, Mark, Liam's brother-in-law, chimed in from across the room. "Yeah, Emma, made enough to buy a house yet?" The guests nearby chuckled. I forced a smile, my cheeks hot, and took my seat. Dinner was a parade of excess, lobster bisque, filet mignon, and endless wine. Richard held court, regaling everyone with stories of his latest courtroom victory. Susan fussed over Claire, Liam's sister, praising her new handbag while ignoring me. Liam tried to shift the spotlight, mentioning my tech contract. "Emma just landed a huge deal," he said proudly. Richard barely glanced up from his plate. "That's nice," he said, then launched into a story about his golf buddy's yacht. Mark smirked, leaning toward me. "Freelancing's cute, but it's not exactly stable, is it?" I bit my tongue, sipping water to stay calm. Liam's hand found mine under the table, a silent apology. As the main course ended, Susan stood, her voice bright. "We've saved something special for the toast, a rare vintage wine from our cellar." She glanced at Richard, who nodded and rose. "I'll help bring it out," he said, heading toward the bar area just off the dining room. The knot in my stomach tightened. Something about their exchange felt rehearsed, but I couldn't pin it down. I excused myself to grab a glass of water, needing a moment to breathe. The bar was a small alcove, partially hidden by a decorative screen. As I approached, I saw Richard pouring wine from a decanter. His back was to me, and he didn't hear my footsteps. I froze when I saw him pull a small, white pill from his jacket pocket. He glanced around, then dropped it into one glass, stirring it with a quick flick of his wrist. The liquid shimmered slightly, a faint haze forming on the surface. My heart slammed against my ribs. He was tampering with someone's drink. I slipped behind the screen, my mind racing. Richard picked up the tray of glasses, his movements casual, like he'd done this before. I waited until he returned to the dining room, then crept back to my seat. When he set the tray down, he placed the tampered glass right in front of me. "For you, Emma," he said, his smile too wide, his eyes locked on mine. "Our finest reserve, just for our favorite designer." The table laughed, thinking it was a playful jab. I forced a thank you, my throat dry. The glass sat there, the faint haze catching the chandelier's light. My hands trembled as I reached for it, pretending to admire the wine. Mark, sitting next to me, was mid-rant about his new Tesla. "Some of us plan for the future," he said, winking at the guests. His wine glass, identical to mine, sat untouched. A wild instinct took over. I couldn't drink that wine, but I couldn't confront Richard, not yet, not without proof. I glanced at Mark, his smug grin burning into me. In a split second, I swapped our glasses, using the excuse of adjusting my napkin to cover the move. My hands shook, but no one noticed. I pushed my chair back slightly, clearing my throat. Actually, I think I'll stick to water for the toast, I said, grabbing a bottle from the table. Susan raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Richard's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his eyes narrowing. I held his gaze, my face neutral, but inside, I was screaming, "I saw you." The toast came and went. Mark raised his glass, downing half the wine in one gulp, oblivious. I sipped my water, my pulse pounding. 30 minutes later, the room shifted. Mark's face went pale, beads of sweat dotting his forehead. He clutched his stomach, muttering, "Something's wrong." He stood, wobbling, and staggered toward the bathroom. The sounds of violent retching echoed through the house, cutting through the chatter. Susan gasped, rushing after him. "Mark! What's happening?" Claire, his wife, followed, her face pale. The guests whispered, confused. Richard stayed seated, his hands gripping the table, his eyes boring into me. In that moment, I knew two things: he'd meant that pill for me, and he knew I'd switched the glasses. The party descended into chaos. Susan returned, saying Mark was probably just sick from the food. Richard nodded, his voice calm. "Bad shellfish, maybe." But his eyes never left me. I ate my dessert, forcing each bite, my mind spinning. What was that pill? Was it meant to hurt me, humiliate me, or worse? I had to stay calm, act like nothing was wrong. When the party ended, I slipped the tampered glass, now Mark's, into my bag, pouring the remaining wine into a small bottle I'd grabbed from the bar. Liam noticed my tension as we drove home. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, my voice tight. "Just tired." But I wasn't tired. I was terrified and furious. That night, I barely slept. The image of Richard stirring that pill into my glass played on repeat. I knew I couldn't let this slide, but I needed answers. The next morning, I called Mia, a college friend who worked at a chemical lab. "I need you to test something," I said, my voice low. "It's urgent." I dropped off the wine sample, my hands shaking as I handed her the bottle. "Emma, what's going on?" she asked. I shook my head. "I'll explain later. Just tell me what's in it." 3 days later, she called, her voice grim. "There's a sedative in here, midazolam. Not enough to kill, but it'd knock someone out for hours, maybe mess with their memory." "Where'd you get this?" I thanked her, promising to explain soon, and hung up. The lab report was a bombshell, but it wasn't enough. I needed to know why Richard targeted me. I started digging. A former colleague of Richard's, someone I'd met at a charity event, agreed to meet for coffee. "Over lattes," he spilled. "Richard's got a reputation," he said. Years ago, he was accused of spiking a rival's drink at a firm party to discredit him. The guy passed out, looked like a drunk, and Richard got his promotion. It was hushed up, but people talk. I pressed further, learning Richard had a prescription for midazolam, supposedly for anxiety, but the dosage was suspiciously high. I tracked down the pharmacy records through a contact in the medical field, confirming he'd refilled it just before the party. Then came the game changer. Claire, Liam's sister, texted me out of the blue, "Meet me at the cafe on 5th. I have something you need." I was wary but went. Claire looked nervous, her hands fidgeting with her coffee cup. "I've been listening," she said quietly. "Mom and Dad, they're not who you think." She slid her phone across the table and played a recording. It was Susan's voice, clear and cold. "If Emma collapses at the party, Liam will see she's not cut out for him. We need him with someone better, Richard." My stomach churned. This wasn't just about humiliating me, it was about destroying my marriage. Claire's eyes met mine. They did this to me too, she whispered. They pushed me into marrying Mark. I can't let them ruin you. I left the cafe with the recording and a fire in my chest. Richard and Susan weren't just snobs, they were manipulators, willing to drug me to control their son's life. I had the lab report, the pharmacy records, and now Susan's voice on tape. But I knew confronting them would take more than evidence. It would take strategy. I wasn't just fighting for myself, I was fighting for Liam, for our marriage, and for the truth. I needed to expose them in a way that left no room for denial, not just to Liam but to the entire family. I decided to stage a reckoning, one they wouldn't see coming. I invited Richard, Susan, Claire, and Mark to our modest Portland apartment under the pretense of clearing the air after the misunderstanding at their anniversary party. Liam, still unaware of the full truth, was hesitant. "Are you sure about this, Emma?" he asked, his brow furrowed. I nodded, squeezing his hand. "Trust me. We need this." The night arrived, and our living room felt too small for the tension. I'd set up a projector connected to my laptop, the screen blank against the wall. Claire arrived first, her face pale but determined. She'd been my secret ally since sending me Susan's recording, and her presence gave me strength. Mark followed, still recovering from the sedative's effects, his usual smirk replaced by a wary scowl. Richard and Susan swept in last, dressed like they were attending a gala, not a family meeting. Susan's smile was tight, her eyes scanning the room. Richard shook my hand, his grip cold. "Let's make this quick, Emma," he said, his tone clipped. "We're all busy." I nodded, gesturing for everyone to sit. Liam sat beside me, his knee bouncing nervously. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding but my voice steady. "Thanks for coming," I began. "I know things got strange at the party. I want to set things right." Susan's shoulders relaxed slightly, a smug glint in her eyes. She thought I was apologizing, backing down. Richard leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, exuding confidence. I clicked the projector on, and the blank screen lit up. "But first," I said, "there's something you all need to see." I started with the lab report, projecting the document for everyone to read. "This is from a chemical analysis of the wine served at the party," I said. It contained midazolam, a sedative strong enough to knock someone out for hours. The room went silent. Mark shifted uncomfortably, his face paling. Liam's eyes widened, darting to me. "Emma, what is this?" he asked. I held up a hand, signaling him to wait. I clicked to the next slide, Richard's pharmacy records, showing his prescription for midazolam, refilled days before the party. "This is where the drug came from," I said, my voice calm but firm. Richard's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Susan broke the silence, her voice shrill. "This is absurd. You're fabricating this to make us look bad." I didn't flinch. "I'm not done," I said, clicking to the next file. Susan's voice filled the room, cold and deliberate, from the recording Claire had sent. "If Emma collapses at the party, Liam will see she's not cut out for him. We need him with someone better, Richard." Liam's face crumpled, his hands clenching into fists. Claire stared at the floor, tears in her eyes. Mark muttered, "What the hell?" under his breath. Susan's face drained of color. "That's not me," she stammered. "Someone edited that." I pressed on, projecting an email from Richard's former colleague, detailing his history of using sedatives to discredit rivals. "This isn't the first time," I said, looking directly at Richard. "You've done this before, spiked drinks, ruined reputations. But this time, you targeted me." Richard finally spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "You're out of line, Emma. This is a family matter, and you're blowing it out of proportion." He turned to Liam. "Son, you know us. You know we'd never do this." Liam's eyes flicked between his parents and me, his expression torn. That's when Claire stood up, her voice shaking but resolute. "Stop lying," she said, glaring at her parents. "I recorded that conversation because I knew what you were planning. You did this to me too, pushed me into marrying Mark because he fit your image, even when I wasn't happy." She turned to Liam, tears streaming down her face. "They broke up your relationship with Sarah, Liam. They faked texts to make you think she cheated. I heard them brag about it." Liam's breath hitched, his hands trembling. "Sarah," he whispered, the name heavy with old pain. He looked at his parents, his voice breaking. "Is this true?" Susan sobbed, but it wasn't remorse, it was panic. "Liam, darling, we only want what's best for you," she cried. Richard slammed his hand on the armrest. "Enough of this nonsense. Emma's manipulating you all, turning you against your own family." His voice boomed, but I didn't waver. I clicked to the final slide, a timeline I'd pieced together, showing Richard's prescription history, the colleague's testimony, and Susan's recording, all aligned with the party's date. "This isn't manipulation," I said, my voice cutting through the room. "This is the truth. You tried to drug me to make me look unreliable, to drive a wedge between me and Liam. And it's not just me, you've been controlling your kids' lives for years." Liam stood, his face a mix of rage and heartbreak. "Why?" he demanded, staring at his parents. "Why would you do this to Emma? To me?" Susan reached for him, but he stepped back. "Don't," he said, his voice raw. "Just tell me the truth." Richard's composure cracked, his face reddening. "You needed someone better," he snapped. "She's a freelancer, Liam. No stability, no future. We were protecting you." The admission hung in the air, heavy and final. Liam shook his head, tears in his eyes. "Protecting me? You almost hurt my wife." Claire moved to Liam's side, touching his arm. "They did it to me too," she said softly. "They made me think Mark was my only option. I've been miserable, but I was too scared to fight back, until Emma did." Mark, who'd been silent, finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "I didn't know," he said, looking at Claire. "I thought you wanted this, us." Claire shook her head, her eyes sad but firm. The room felt like it was collapsing under the weight of their words. I turned to Richard and Susan, my voice steady. "You crossed a line. I have all this evidence, recordings, documents, witnesses. I could send it to the Bar Association, your clients, your precious social circle. But I won't, yet. Not because you deserve mercy, but because I don't want to hurt Liam or Claire more than you already have." I paused, letting the words sink in. "But if you ever try to interfere in our lives again, I won't hesitate. Every email, every file, will go public." Richard's face twisted, a mix of fury and defeat. Susan's sobs grew louder, but no one comforted her. Liam looked at me, his eyes red but resolute. "Emma, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I should have seen it." I reached for his hand, my own eyes stinging. "It's okay," I said. "We're in this together now." Claire nodded, wiping her tears. "All of us," she said, glancing at Mark, who looked shell-shocked but didn't argue. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard and Susan had no defense left, their perfect facade shattered. I shut off the projector, the screen going dark. "We're done here," I said. "You can leave." Richard stood, pulling Susan up with him. She clung to his arm, still crying, but he didn't look at me. For the first time, he had nothing to say. They walked out, the door closing behind them with a soft click. Liam sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. Claire sat beside him, and I knew this was just the beginning of unraveling their family's lies. But for now, we'd taken the first step, together. I closed my laptop, my hands trembling from the adrenaline. I'd won this round, but the victory felt hollow. Exposing Richard and Susan hadn't just shattered their facade, it had broken something in Liam and Claire, and I wasn't sure how we'd piece it back together. Liam looked up at me, his eyes red. "Emma, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice raw. "I should have seen it. I should have protected you." My heart ached for him. He'd spent his life believing his parents wanted the best for him, only to learn they'd orchestrated his relationships like a chess game. I knelt beside him, taking his hands. "This isn't your fault," I said firmly. "They hid it from you, from all of us. But we know the truth now, and we'll figure out what's next together." He nodded, but the pain in his eyes told me it'd be a long road. Claire stepped forward, her voice soft but steady. "I should have spoken up sooner," she said, glancing at me. "I knew they were controlling, but I never thought they'd go this far." She turned to Liam. "When they pushed me into marrying Mark, I convinced myself it was for the best. But seeing what they did to Emma, I couldn't stay quiet anymore." Mark shifted uncomfortably, finally meeting her gaze. "Claire, I didn't know," he said, his voice low. "I thought you chose me." Claire's eyes softened, but she shook her head. "I did, in a way. But it wasn't free. They made sure of that." The honesty between them was raw, a crack in the perfect image Richard and Susan had forced on their family. I stood, trying to anchor the room. "We need time to process this," I said. "But we also need to protect ourselves. I meant what I said. I won't release the evidence unless they force me to. But we need boundaries." Liam nodded, his jaw tight. "I don't want them near us for a while," he said. "Not until I can trust them again, if that's even possible." Claire agreed. "I'm done letting them control my life," she said. "I need to figure out what I want, not what they want." Mark said nothing, but his silence felt like a concession. The next few days were a blur. Liam and I decided to pause contact with Richard and Susan, a decision that felt both liberating and heavy. Liam was quiet, wrestling with the betrayal. I suggested therapy, and he agreed, wanting to untangle the years of manipulation he'd never noticed. We found a counselor who specialized in family dynamics, and our first session was emotional but grounding. Liam opened up about how his parents' expectations had shaped him, from pushing him into engineering to sabotaging his past relationships, like with Sarah. "I thought I was making my own choices," he said, his voice breaking. "But they were pulling the strings." I held his hand, promising we'd rebuild our life on our terms. Claire became an unexpected ally. She called me the day after the confrontation, her voice stronger than before. "I'm filing for divorce," she said. "Mark and I talked, and we both know our marriage was built on my parents' lies. I need to start over." I admired her courage, knowing how hard it was to break free from Richard and Susan's grip. She started spending more time with us, joining us for coffee or helping me brainstorm ideas for my graphic design studio. One afternoon, she brought over a box of old photos and letters, including some from Sarah, Liam's ex. "I found these in Mom's study," she said. They kept them like trophies. The letters confirmed what Claire had said. Richard and Susan had faked evidence to make Sarah seem unfaithful, driving her out of Liam's life. Liam read them in silence, tears falling, but afterward, he seemed lighter, like a weight had lifted. I dove deeper into the evidence, wanting to understand the full scope of Richard and Susan's control. I reached out to Sarah, now living in Seattle, and she agreed to talk. Over a video call, she shared how Susan had sent her forged texts, supposedly from Liam, accusing her of cheating. "I tried to tell him the truth," she said, "but by then, he didn't trust me." They won. Her story mirrored mine, and I realized Richard and Susan had a playbook: isolate, discredit, control. I compiled everything: Sarah's testimony, Claire's recording, the lab report, Richard's pharmacy records, onto a secure USB drive. It was my insurance policy, a safeguard against any future moves by Richard and Susan. My career became my refuge. The tech company I'd contracted with loved my designs, and they offered me a retainer for ongoing work. The income was enough to lease a small studio space downtown, a dream I'd held for years. Liam threw himself into helping me set it up, painting walls and assembling furniture. "This is yours," he said one evening, standing in the empty space. "No one can take it away." Claire helped too, designing flyers for the studio's launch and connecting me with her event planning contacts. Even Mark reached out, sending a text, "I was a jerk, Emma. I didn't see what they were doing. I'm sorry." I replied politely, not ready to forgive but appreciating the gesture. He and Claire were navigating their separation, and I hoped they'd both find peace. 3 months after the confrontation, a certified letter arrived from Richard's law firm. Inside was a check for $50,000, made out to me, with a note, "For your studio." No apology, no explanation, just cold, hard cash. Liam stared at the check, his face unreadable. "This is their way of admitting they were wrong," he said. "But it's not enough." I agreed. The money could expand the studio, hire an assistant, or upgrade my equipment, but it didn't erase what they'd done. We deposited it but set strict rules: no contact unless they initiated it, and only on our terms. Liam wanted space, and I wanted safety. Claire's divorce proceedings moved forward, and she started therapy too, unraveling years of her parents' influence. She and Liam grew closer, leaning on each other as they redefined what family meant. One night, over pizza at our place, Claire raised her glass. "To us," she said, smiling at me and Liam. "The ones who fought back." Liam clinked his glass, his eyes warm. "To Emma," he said. "For showing me the truth." I blushed, but the moment felt right, a new beginning, built on honesty. Richard and Susan faded into the background. They sent occasional texts, asking about Liam or Claire, but we kept our distance. The USB drive stayed locked in a safe, a reminder of what they were capable of. I didn't want revenge, I wanted freedom. My studio took shape, its walls lined with my designs, each one a testament to my resilience. Liam and I grew stronger, our marriage no longer shadowed by his parents' expectations. We were learning to trust again, not just each other but ourselves. As the weeks passed, I felt a shift inside me. Exposing Richard and Susan hadn't just protected my marriage, it had freed me from the need to prove myself to them. I wasn't the doodler they mocked or the outsider they rejected. I was Emma Carter, a designer, a wife, a fighter. And for the first time, I knew that was enough. A year after I exposed Richard and Susan's attempt to drug me, I stood in my Portland studio, surrounded by walls covered in my designs, vibrant app interfaces, sleek branding, and bold posters. The space was mine, built from years of late nights and relentless hustle. Now amplified by the tech contract that had once seemed like a distant dream. Liam stood beside me, his arm around my waist, as we prepared for the studio's grand opening. "You did this," he whispered, his voice full of pride. I smiled, but the journey to this moment hadn't been easy. It wasn't just about surviving his parents' betrayal, it was about learning who I was and what I'd fight for. Liam and I had rebuilt our marriage on stronger ground. Therapy helped him process his parents' manipulation, from their sabotage of his past relationships to their attempt to control our future. He set firm boundaries with Richard and Susan, limiting contact to brief, neutral exchanges. "They're my parents," he told me one night, "but you're my family." Those words carried us through the hard days. We started small traditions, Sunday hikes, late-night pizza runs, reclaiming our life from the shadow of his family's expectations. Claire became a constant in our lives. After divorcing Mark, she moved into a small apartment and began rediscovering herself. She took up painting, something her parents had once dismissed, and her work hung in my studio, a symbol of her freedom. She and Liam leaned on each other, healing the wounds of their upbringing. One evening, over coffee, she hugged me. "You gave me the courage to fight back," she said. I shook my head. "You had it all along." Richard and Susan never apologized, but their actions spoke. The $50,000 they sent for my studio was their version of surrender, a grudging acknowledgement of my place in Liam's life. They visited the studio once, unannounced. Susan complimented a design, her voice stiff. Richard nodded at the space, muttering, "Impressive." It wasn't warmth, but it was respect, hard-won and cold. We kept them at arm's length, meeting only on our terms, a holiday dinner at a neutral restaurant, a brief call to check in. The USB drive with the evidence stayed locked away, a silent promise that I'd act if they ever crossed us again. My biggest lesson wasn't about defeating Richard and Susan, it was about defining my worth. I'd spent years chasing their approval, thinking it would validate my career, my marriage, me. But standing up to them showed me I didn't need it. I was enough, my creativity, my grit, my love for Liam. The studio's opening was packed with friends, clients, and my mom, who flew in from Idaho, her eyes shining with pride. As I gave a short speech, thanking everyone, I caught Liam's gaze. He mouthed, "I love you," and I knew we'd won, not by destroying his parents but by building a life they couldn't touch. If you've ever faced a family that tried to break you, know this: your value isn't in their words or their games. It's in the choices you make, the people you stand by, the dreams you fight for. I found my strength not in revenge but in living well, on my terms, with the family I chose. Have you ever had to stand up to toxic in-laws? Share your story below, and let's keep this conversation going.